A little over a year ago, I shared a video that showed my process for how I went from an overwhelming 56 colors down to 16 to 18 colors on my watercolor palette. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it below, but it basically showed my whole process from research, my decisions for how I decided on my new colors, to swatching and discussing what made each one special. I've lived with those colors for over a year now, using them multiple times per week, if not almost daily, and making hundreds of sketches and paintings along the way. So basically, I've learned them inside out. The beauty of working with a limited palette for so long is that you gain an intimate understanding of how each color acts on its own and when mixed with others. So if I see or imagine a color, I know exactly which pigments to mix together to make it. It takes away lots of guesswork and just lets me paint very intuitively. So having lived with these colors for that long, I've finally come to the point where I feel ready to make some changes. In this video, I'll share my insights about this process and show my new colors while explaining what makes them special and how I plan on using them. With all the colors available to us in this internet age, why the heck would I stick with 16 colors for over a year? Okay, I totally understand why people ask that. And it is completely personal to my way of working. So for my process, I need to have a very, very thorough and instant, practically subconscious understanding of my colors, which is why I am obsessed with color charts and color mixing and I've done so many videos about this topic. And while it is extremely tempting to buy custom colors, and especially with all of the artists that I watch online constantly doing unboxing and swatching videos of beautiful handmade watercolor palettes, and trust me, it is tempting. But then I remember, last week I had a really rough plein air session because I couldn't figure out how to mix a certain shade of green. And then it reminds me, I am not familiar enough yet with my colors, let alone buying brand new colors and practically starting over. And for me to get to that point of very thorough, intuitive understanding of my colors, it takes a long time and a lot of brush mileage. So on one hand, I completely understand and value the experience of buying new colors and exploring them and just being really excited and inspired to paint with brand new colors. For my specific practice, for my way of working, if I want to have a less frustrating process, then I just have to be diligent and disciplined and go through this process. I tend to use certain colors for certain types of scenes. Like for my coastal paintings, I reach more for the phthalos because I love making those rich turquoise colors. And for some of my highland type, the scenes that are more inland away from the coast, I find myself reaching a lot more for the earthy tones. And I find that it takes a while to get used to making certain mixes. If I'm not constantly painting one type of scene, it's going to take me that much longer to get used to them. And to be honest, even after a whole year, I feel like I've barely touched the surface of what's possible with my limited palette. But along the way, I have discovered some colors or some mixes that just aren't quite right, and I found some gaps in my palette that I need to fill. This requires changing out a couple colors, and spoiler, soon you're gonna see how I make my own colors based on the tubes of paint that I own. First of all, I spent a long time researching which colors I thought I would be really happy with in my palette, and for the most part, I was right. There are a couple things that need to change, which I'll explain, and along the way, I'll also give as much insight as I can to my process for how I chose them in the first place, but why it didn't quite fit. I also want to mention that I've been using these not only in my studio palette, but also in my travel palettes. So I've had a lot of experience with them inside and out. In my last video, I mentioned that Sennelier Neutral Tint was one of my longtime favorites. I had been using it since I started watercolor and I had just fallen in love with it. So that's why I kept that one on my palette as opposed to a black or the classic Payne's Gray. But over time, I've started to realize that the fact that it has multiple pigments means that it doesn't dry very predictable, which in some cases is great, but in other cases it's just plain frustrating. So I'm at the point where I'm gonna experiment with some other black type colors. Blues and greens are another area that needs some adjustment. My blues have been great, but I find that I actually have one too many, so I was trying to figure out which one to get rid of, and it came down to the fact that my Phthalo Sapphire Blue just wasn't different enough to justify keeping it on my very limited palette. As for green, I absolutely love my choices, but I also find that I rarely use my Serpentine Genuine because I find I'm mixing my brighter greens more often, and as much as it is convenient and really nice to have, I also just am not a huge fan of the brown undertones anymore, so if I want to add brown undertones, I will do it myself. So we're gonna make some custom greens together. Now, yellows are where I'm making the biggest change. Hansa Yellow is not the most light fast option as much as I love it, so I'm switching it out for something new. And soon I'll show you my research and swatching process for how I choose a new yellow, because in my opinion, blue and yellow are the most important colors on the palette, so I'm not messing around with yellow. Some people might be surprised to hear that I'm keeping my very opaque colors, which are the English Venetian Red and Yellow Ochre. And the main reason for that is because they are so incredibly useful for mixing earthy tones. And the fact that they're opaque doesn't present a challenge as much as someone might think. In fact, it provides even more versatility for this palette because most of my other colors are extremely transparent. One of the most common questions I get is why don't I have a red on my palette, like a classic cadmium red or something similar. I have reddish colors, but they mostly lean either more towards browns or more towards pinks. Well, the main reason for that is because I'm using a limited palette, I want as much versatility as I can get. With a cadmium red, my options of mixing are limited. With something like quinacridone magenta, I can actually mix that with yellow to make red. So I don't need to have red as a separate place on my palette. The purple that's on my palette is a custom mix between my quinacridone magenta and my ultramarine. What I found though is that it's far too intense for my average purple in a landscape, so I'm actually going to mix a more earthy muted purple in its place. When it came to choosing new colors, I first looked through all of my past rejects to see if there was anything worth trying again. Turns out there wasn't, but I did have some really good notes about some new colors that I was thinking about before that might have potential now. So it was time to jump online and do some digging. The easiest thing is to stick with what you know, and I am very comfortable with my Schmincke tubes of watercolors. I just love the consistency and the quality, the pigment load, so I'm more than happy to buy within this brand again. So I started by looking at my dot card, and the great thing about these is that once you activate the paint and you get a little stripe of color, you can see all the variations within that color, which is super important to me. I really don't like working off of a monitor color or something that's been printed on paper. Something like this is far more useful. First up, I wanted to look at which color I could replace my neutral tint with, and I was definitely leaning towards a black. But there are a lot of blacks out there, and of course it is super personal. So I had to really think about what type of black would be the most useful in my palette. One of the reasons I loved neutral tint was that it didn't just look black, it had some color in it. But the tricky part about that is that sometimes when I mixed several of my colors on my palette, they got a little bit too muddy. So this time, instead of going with a slightly colored black, I decided to go with a lamp black, which to me looked like one of the most intense blacks. So I figured if I start with that, I can always mix a color into it if I wanted to tint it slightly. But because I'm a bit obsessive about this process, I decided to jump online and look at some comparison videos by some of my favorite YouTubers. I like to do this mainly to see all the variations in the different brands of a single color. So each brand is going to have a different lamp black. And I find it really useful to see them actually being used in different scenarios. And I'm really glad I did this because I honestly wouldn't have thought about buying Winsor & Newton. Not that I don't like them. I actually use their colors and I have all Winsor & Newton gouache, but I just was thinking of Schminke because that's what I use the most. So after watching a bunch of videos, I discovered that Winsor & Newton was a really beautiful, rich, and deep black, so I just went ahead and bought it. Figured I would buy a 5mm tube and just try it out. Well, obsessive research apparently pays off because I absolutely love this color. Not only is this lamp black really, really deep and rich, but also provides some really lovely grays, it mixes so beautifully with my colors. So this is a typical page that I would make when I'm trying out colors for the first time. Just really messy and fun and experimental, and along the way I'm sort of keeping mental notes and then, sometimes writing them down as well, but I try to give myself at least one page where I can just have fun with the colors. So for every new color I try, I will mix it with each of my existing colors and even try mixing like 3 or 4 colors together to see what happens. All the while, I'm thinking about how I would use this in a landscape. Would it be useful? Does it actually fit my aesthetic? And I have to be really honest with myself along the way, like it has to be enjoyable to use and it has to allow me to create colors that I actually love. Not only do I need to pay attention to whether it plays nicely with my other colors and I can create beautiful mixes, but I need to know that I can control the paint the way I want to. And of course that always comes with time and practice, but with my neutral tint, I knew that as soon as I touch it into water, it's very, very active. It spreads quickly. This one isn't quite so active, so it'll just be something to get used to. I do have to say, though, that I was able to create some absolutely gorgeous kind of neutral purples, so I may go ahead and use this for my custom purple. We'll see. And now onto the yellows. Like I said, I consider yellow to be one of the most important colors on my palette. I mix yellow with almost everything in every single painting. So I had done a lot of research about yellows before, and I went with Hansa yellow previously because it's such a brilliantly clear color and it makes gorgeous mixes. But it's not the most light fast. So after doing lots of research, I found this color called bismuth yellow or bismuth vanadium yellow. It has various names and each brand is going to call it something different. But it's a very, very bright yellow and extremely light fast. So I bought 3 different brands and I'm gonna try it out with my colors and see which one gives me the best mixes. And not only am I testing out the actual yellow, but I'm also using this as an opportunity to make some custom greens. So primarily mixing with my various blues in order to explore the green potential of this color. And the first thing I noticed while using this paint is that it's kind of opaque. which made me a bit nervous because in the past I preferred to use transparent yellows so that I would get very, very clean mixes, but I found that this color has very high tinting strength. So not only am I getting clean mixes, but the fact that it's slightly opaque means that I get an even brighter boost from that opacity. So these greens turned out really vibrant. I don't think the camera will ever do it justice. Just trust me, in person, these colors like seriously pop off the page. I will spare you an almost identical swatching montage, but basically these two other yellows that I got, the Bismuth Vanadate Yellow by Daniel Smith and the Bismuth Yellow by Winsor Newton, are nearly identical. So I'm glad I have them on pages side by side so that I could really see that. And to be honest, I really liked the Schmincke more than these ones because the colors were just more vibrant in general. So I'm gonna keep these two as backup, and it's nice to know that I have that just in case. You don't need to actually grind your own pigments and make your own handmade watercolors to make custom mixes. It's as simple as squeezing a bit of color out of the tube and mixing it with another color. You can mix 2 or 3 or even 4 tubes together to make whatever mix you want. So when I sit down to make my custom mixes, I usually go through quite a few sketchbook pages to find that perfect blend. As I mentioned earlier, I'm on a mission to make a few custom greens as well as a more neutral purple. So in this next section, I'll show you a bit of my experimenting and talk about that process. I've always been a believer in function over form, and that goes for everything in my life, from clothing to the way I set up my home to my watercolor palette. So first of all, I think about what do I actually need in my landscapes. I need a very vibrant green that I can use for backlit leaves. I need a lovely deep turquoise bluish green that I can use for my coastal scenes. I need a very earthy green that I can use for a variety of scenes. And I need a very neutral, almost muted purple that I can use for lots of shadows. And some of you might be wondering why I don't just go buy a sap green or, 100 other colors that I can find in tubes that are pre-mixed for me. Well, the biggest reason is because I already absolutely love the colors that are on my palette. And the more I use these colors to make my own custom mixes, the easier it will be to know the colors front to back, and it'll be much easier to harmonize my paintings because I'm using such a limited palette. So if I make my own greens from the existing colors on my palette, it just makes the process that much easier. Here's a look at my final colors. If you want to watch the full swatching and hear my thoughts about each color, I have a whole separate video dedicated to swatching my new palette. But for the rest of this video, I wanted to answer a bunch of frequently asked questions about this whole process and my new palette, because when I told everyone on Instagram that I was doing this, I received quite a few questions. And just to let you know, if you want to see the high resolution scan of this color chart, it's up on my Patreon. And while I do this Q&A, I'm just going to let you watch my glazing test, which is just me doing one more layer of color on the edge of each of these swatches. First question, what are your thoughts towards building a balanced palette? Do you intentionally choose colors that are complements of each other? How many colors are too many? Okay, this is a bunch of questions in one, but I get the idea. This person also mentioned that they have a hodgepodge of student grade colors and are wanting to invest in a more professional selection. So my biggest piece of advice would be to get a dot card of any of the brands you're considering, which, let's face it, every country is going to have different levels of affordable professional colors. So looking at art stores that are in your area or places that ship to you, look for dot cards or hand-painted swatch sheets, because these are going to be very useful in the initial stages. These will give you a good feel for what the colors look like in person without having to spend a bunch on the tubes. And when it comes to actually buying colors, I recommend getting a couple blues, a couple yellows, a couple reds. This will get you started and you'll learn very quickly which ones you like and which ones you don't. You'll also realize where things are missing, and then you can start building your palette based off of that. When you're first trying a brand or a color, I recommend getting one of the little half pans or the 5mm tubes because you can try it out, and then if you end up loving it, you can always invest in one of the bigger tubes. But if you end up hating it, it's not like you have a ton of it lying around. Every artist is going to go through this process no matter what they paint with or what brands they like. Each of our criteria are going to be different. So for me, as a landscape artist who has a very specific style and aesthetic, I will lean towards colors that you might actually hate or, vice versa. And it really does come down to trying them out. One good piece of advice is to start with a warm and a cool blue, a warm and a cool yellow, and a warm and a cool red. So that gives you a lot of versatility with only 6 colors. I do also find having a gray or a black on the palette is extremely useful, but with all of those colors you can mix greens and purples and whatever else you might need. And for me, over the years, I've realized that it's really good to have a palette that does complement itself, or the colors complement each other. So when I mix them together, do they create beautiful mixes or do they fight each other? That is a very important thing for me to consider whenever I'm looking for new colors. This leads me to the next question, which is basically like, what criteria do I use for choosing new colors? And in the swatching video that hopefully you'll go watch next, I do explain a lot about why I choose the colors I choose and how I like to use them. But the major criteria I consider are, first of all, is it a non-toxic color? Because I don't want to be washing down like heavy metal paints in the sink or worry about my cat jumping up on the desk and drinking my paint water when I turn my back. And of course, another huge criteria factor is how well do the colors mix together? Because I've found over time that some colors just don't give me nice, clean mixes. So when it comes to yellows, for instance, I really consider the tinting strength, meaning how well does it mix with my other colors? Does it allow those other colors to shine through? Does it create bright, clean mixes? Or does it create more of a muddy, earthy tone? Which I talk about in my swatching video. Not all muddy colors are bad colors. Sometimes they're extremely useful. But all of these things are taken into consideration, and the more you paint, the more you develop your own criteria. I had quite a few other questions that sort of go along the same vein, which is basically, how did I finally get to the point where I know what colors I want to use? And honestly, this is something that you constantly develop over time, and it will probably change a lot over the course of your artistic life. So when I first started, I had a little Cotman travel set of watercolors, which is a limited palette, and the more I used it, the more I realized what colors I liked and didn't like, and when I felt it was time to upgrade to a professional brand, my decisions were informed by the experiences I had with that palette. So don't be afraid to start out with something simple, and then work your way up to a professional palette that suits your specific needs. In the description below, I have a link to all of the supplies I use now, as well as some things I've used in the past, like the Cotman travel set, because for me, that was a really great beginner set, and it was just something affordable that got me started. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. A ton of time and effort went into making it, so I would super appreciate a thumbs up, which tells YouTube that I did a pretty good job. And of course, don't forget to go watch the swatching video next, where I will share lots of insights about the colors I chose for my final palette. Okay, take care. See you there.